we think that hydrogen will be, in fact, dominant force in aviation, and the matter is just in what kind of time period. Yeah, so we think that by 2050 could be 25%.
I mean, I know Airbus, I think, has been more vocal about going to hydrogen sooner. Or I know Boeing's sort of been very sustainable aviation fuel oriented.
I think hydrogen kind of goes through these hype cycles. I think everybody sort of suggests it could play a big role in this energy transition long-term equation, but a lot of the oil majors do have hydrogen investments, and if you kind of look at where they're at, they're saying, well, look, we can make it, but there's no demand yet.
As George mentioned, on the roadmap, we get to single aisle next decade.
We know that a large proportion of the cost of a typical combustion engine nowadays is over the life of it as you maintain that engine, right? You typically get a pretty steep discount on the initial engine. And I'd just be curious about your thoughts on how hydrogen works. Is it one that maintenance is going to be similar, or maintenance is less or higher? How does that kind of work?
100x less, fewer rotating parts. We think that the motors that we're building will be good for life of the aircraft.
First off, in my world of renewable fuels and SAF, hyper focused on carbon intensity. If you can kind of just share first before we get into things a little bit more, what's kind of the carbon intensity of a hydrogen powered fuel cell aircraft? How does that compare to SAF, and kind of why is it a better solution long term than combustion and using sustainable aviation fuels?
90 to 95% abatement of all climate effects. So there are several vectors, of course, and we looked at all of them. And great to see the experts here on SAF, for example, and some of the others. But we think that fundamentally, if you look from the first principles, hydrogen is really the best fuel.
My name is Rob Barnett, and I'd like to welcome you to today's BI Energy Exchange. We've got a very special conversation today, a little bit different from our usual setup. We've got Val Miftakhov, who is the CEO of ZeroAvia, joining us for a conversation that we're going to really try to unpack how hydrogen may play a role in the aviation industry, and that's what his company is up to. Also on the call today, we've got George Ferguson joining from our office in Princeton, New Jersey. George is our senior analyst covering aerospace and defense companies such as Boeing and some of the major global airlines. We've also, swinging down to our Washington, D.C. office, we've got Brett Gibbs joining us. I think folks on this call will probably know Brett because he's a regular here, but Brett is our senior analyst looking after the refining and biofuel space with a view on SAF. So, Val, we're going to come to you first. I think we normally speak to an energy-focused crowd here. So I think folks in the energy world, hydrogen is a buzzword still at the moment. And so I think in many ways, folks are trying to unpack energy transition. What does 2050 look like? Sort of these big long-term questions, and hydrogen is a big piece of that equation, I think, or it could be at least. And so I'm curious to hear from you, what is ZeroAvia trying to do in the space? How are we really going to put hydrogen on aircraft? Kind of give us the vision for what you're trying to do and tell us what the opportunity could look like.
Absolutely. Well, great to be here. Thanks for the invite. Rob, well, hydrogen is definitely a big part of the future. And for transportation, it's even bigger in the relative terms. And for aviation, we think is even bigger than that. And the reason is, and that's why I started a company 7 years ago after selling my previous company that was already in infrastructure space. We built charging stations for electric cars, smart grid, energy control for electric vehicles, all of that, right? So got a very good insider view in how the EV transformation happens, right? So automotive, and now we are on path to 100%, what I think will be 100% electric transport on the ground. So similar transition will happen in aviation. Just by construction, we have to go to the sustainable aviation future. And so there are several vectors, of course, and we looked at all of them. And great to see the experts here on SAF, for example, and some of the others. But we think that fundamentally, if you look from the first principles, hydrogen is really the best fuel, right? It's the lightest fuel possible. Even with the containment of that fuel in vessels, it can be made lighter than jet fuel, even at the aircraft level, at the system level. And then the way we convert that fuel into propulsion, which is produce electricity through fuel cells and then run the motors with the fuel cell produced electricity, that is much more efficient way to use the fuel rather than combust. Yeah, so you have significant efficiency on the sort of fuel storage and the fuel use side. And then once you use the fuel, your emission profile is super benign, right, for hydrogen electric or hydrogen fuel cell based propulsion, because you don't have combustion, you don't have NOx, you don't have high temperature water vapor, which is very hard to control and produces all kinds of climate effects at altitude. You don't have particulate matter, which you would have even with SAF. So on the fuel use and fuel efficiency, it's better. On the impact on the climate and environment, is better. So as a result, we think that hydrogen will be, in fact, dominant force in aviation. And the matter is just in what kind of time period. Yeah. So we think that by 2050 could be 25%.
If I could just maybe follow up quickly before we sort of bring on some of our other folks here. We met at a Bloomberg's Green Festival in Seattle, had a nice conversation there. And I think one of the things I was most captivated by what you were talking about is this idea of like, how does your technology work? I don't think you're not reinventing and sort of selling new aircraft. I think your idea or your vision is to do retrofits. So can you give us a sense of how that works with this technology?
Yeah, so we are the first and foremost engine manufacturer, or engine replace. Some people say, well, it's an electric motor, it's not an engine, but anyway, so we're the engine company, right? So the aviation market is quite different from automotive market in that you have aircraft manufacturers, familiar names, right? Boeing, Airbus, Embraer, and others. And engine manufacturers, and the top four, Pratt & Whitney and others. And these two segments are very separate. Yeah, that gives an opportunity for an entrant like us, with novel technology to come in and work with all the aircraft manufacturers, because we're not competing with them. We are providing our propulsion to them and to the operators. So we, in fact, have built over the last 7 years partnerships with a lot of major aircraft manufacturers, about 8 at this point, including Textron, which is the largest manufacturer of small planes, and Airbus, who is also one of the lead investors in the company, who is the largest manufacturer of large planes, and everyone in between. Yeah, well, not everyone yet, but over half of the manufacturers that matter in this space, we already have partnerships with. So we produce the engines. We then put them on the airplanes. Sometimes those airplanes come from the fleets of our operator customers, like would be United, American, British Airways, Alaska Airlines, all customers and investors in the company already. So we can take the fleet aircraft and replace the engines. By the way, the reason these markets are separate is because the maintenance intervals and the type of technology expertise you need to have to service aircraft, very different from the engines, right? So typical aircraft, commercial aircraft, goes through multiple sets of engines over its lifetime. So that's a natural separation of market. Every time that replacement occurs, that's an opportunity for us to come in and bring in the new technology. Yeah, so that's the idea there.
Thank you, Val. George, let's swing over to you. I mean, you've been looking at this space for many decades at this point, and whenever something new like this comes in, I'm sure there's a little bit of a level of skepticism, but want to get your reaction. Where do you think the Airbuses and the Boeings are headed on this type of big picture question?
Sure. Thanks, Rob. Yeah. So, I mean, I know Airbus, I think, is been more vocal about going to hydrogen sooner. Or I know Boeing's sort of been very sustainable aviation fuel oriented. I guess one of the first couple of questions I'd have for you is from a maintenance perspective on the engines, right? We know that a large proportion of the cost of a typical combustion engine nowadays is over the life of it as you maintain that engine, right? You typically get a pretty steep discount on the initial engine. And I'd just be curious about your thoughts on how hydrogen works. Is it one that maintenance is going to be similar, or maintenance is less or higher? How does that kind of work? And then I guess the other big questions I'd have for you is, looking at your website, I see what you're looking for: a turboprop by 2025, a 40 to 80 seat regional by 2027, and a 90 seat regional by 2029. Maybe help us understand what's the pacing technology that that you're sort of working with to get those larger sizes. I mean, we all know the largest portion of fleets globally are the sort of narrow body 150s ish. So I'd be curious to hear about the pacing technology. When do you think you get to that 150 ish? And so that's my initial thoughts.
Yeah, great question. Great questions, George. So on maintenance, not quite direct comparison or direct analogy, but I'll make it anyway, imperfect one. So with electric vehicles, for example, right? So you look at the combustion vehicles, look at the maintenance there, you look at the EVs on the grounds, and the maintenance can be 10x lower costs, right? So and that's a reflection of the fact that you don't have high temperatures, you don't have high pressures in the system. You have a single rotating part. Well, it's actually more than a single, but nice slogan there for EVs. But definitely, hundreds less, 100x less. A lot of the similar thoughts translate into the aviation, into hydrogen electric aviation, especially, right? So again, we don't combust, yeah. So you don't have high temperature, high pressure, which drives fundamentally from the physics perspective, it drives wear and tear on the engines and the inspection intervals and the overhauls and all those things, right? So this is really the fuel cell system itself is a solid state system, right? Nothing moves. There is a compressor there, but it's much less stressed than a typical turbine, yeah. And there is redundancy there as well, right? So it's not a single engine, not just a single unit that if something fails in the engine components, then you lose all power, right? So it's quite a bit more resilient, and it's a solid state system, so it's much lower maintenance costs there. And then electric motors, just direct translation from the automotive experience. Yeah. So again, 100x less, fewer rotating parts. We think that the motors that we're building will be good for life of the aircraft. So easily, 30,000 hours type endurance on the motors and power electronics, which are integrated. On the fuel cells, fuel cell systems, we're targeting similar TBO, time before overhauls intervals as the large turbine engines. And for small aircraft, and let's go into the timelines and the roadmap. So for small aircraft that we're starting with, like 10 to 20 seat aircraft, the engines there, one thing is very inefficient, right? The Pratt & Whitney PT6 engine is a mainstay there, is about 80% of the market. It's about 22%, 25% efficient compared to with the fuel cell system that we're already flying third generation now, and it's the engine design is already in certification. That's 50% efficient. So you use half of the chemical energy of the fuel to begin with, and then on the maintenance side, that engine has 1,800 hour, so less than 2,000 hour hot section inspection, when typically engine has to go off wing, aircraft stands still and is not used. Yeah, and then 4,000 hours or less complete engine overhaul or replacement. So we are targeting 10,000 hours for that engine for an overhaul basis, which is similar to what you will see on the larger aircraft, let's say a 70-seat turboprop. Yeah. On the timelines, roadmap, and pacing technology, really it's a fuel cell mass performance, or specific power, how much power we can get out of the unit of weight or mass of the fuel cell system. And we have in-house fuel cell development, high temperature fuel cell development, which our partners are pretty excited about. Well, we're excited about. Partners like Airbus pretty excited about as well, which is the next generation of fuel cell systems from the automotive. Like the automotive are relatively robust. We have multiple cars on the roads, car types, over 100,000 vehicles on the ground, but they all use what's called low temperature fuel cells, which is below 100 C, below boiling temperature of water. The downside there is that it's hard to get the heat out of those systems. They're relatively cold relative to the ambient air, and when you have to certify to operations on the tarmac in Phoenix, for example, in the middle of the summer, it's hard to get the heat out. And you can see it on the cars, on the hydrogen cars like Toyota Mirai, huge radiators up front, and hydrogen trucks as well, like huge radiators, thermal exchangers. And high temperature fuel cells allow you to make it much easier, much smaller heat exchangers, better thermal management. That's the pacing technology. And as we develop it, we already have first versions of it. As we develop it, it becomes closer and closer to larger and larger engines in terms of performance.
Hey, Val,
Nice.
Thanks again for joining us too. I have a couple of questions. First off, in my world of renewable fuels and SAF, hyper focused on carbon intensity. If you can kind of just share first before we get into things a little bit more, what's kind of the carbon intensity of a hydrogen powered fuel cell aircraft? How does that compare to SAF, and kind of why is it a better solution long term than combustion and using sustainable aviation fuels?
Yeah, sure. So on the carbon intensity, it's pretty much, on the operating basis, it's all the way going down to zero, right? And in fact, on the climate impact on the operating basis, it's going all the way down to zero. If you take the full life cycle, then it's not just our data, right? People have done the analysis. I think Aerospace Technology Institute in the UK and Clean Aviation joint undertaking in the EU have done the analysis or commissioned the analysis, published it. 90 to 95% abatement of all climate effects by hydrogen electric, by the fuel cell side. And again, the reason is that, your efficiency of the fuel use is better, right? So we talked about the small engine, but it translates all the way up to, even for the single aisle that George mentioned. Your typical engine there would be 40-45% efficient, which is still shy of what you can get with fuel cells. Like best in class fuel cells that NASA used for some of the space applications are upwards of 70% efficient. Right now, a little bit more expensive than what we are using. People do some interesting things when cost is no problem. Unfortunately, or fortunately, we're operating in a real business environment. But point is that significantly higher efficiency. So that drives lower not just costs, but also the impact, right? Because you need to produce that fuel, you need to build the larger electrolyzer if you're less efficient, or the larger fuel production. So we need less fuel, yeah. And then the idea, of course, for this is hydrogen comes from zero emission sources. Yeah, ideally from renewable zero emission electricity, right? So solar farm somewhere. Like let's say California, New Mexico or similar, and hooked directly to the electrolyzer capacity, produce hydrogen, distribute hydrogen with zero emission trucks, right? So that you complete zero on operating basis. So that's the path, right? And like I said, by third party estimates, this is the best way to get as close as possible to zero impact. And we need to get to that point, right? So just, taking a third of the impact out is not sufficient. And that's what you that's what you would have with something like SAF, for example, right? The reason is because in aviation for high altitude operations, your climate impact is, the majority of it is actually not even carbon, right? And there is this academic consensus on it. Half of the industry already agrees with it. And these are drivers like NOx, high temperature water vapor, some of the particulate emissions that serve as condensation nucleus for the clouds and things like that. The error bars are high, but people are arguing between, hey, is it a 2x on top or 4x on top, right? It's not like, hey, what does it exist or not? It exists. It's just the magnitude of the effect that people are arguing with. So if you do complete SAF replacement tomorrow, right, which I would argue also has some economic problems, but you have complete SAF replacement tomorrow, you will still have all the non-carbon effects of it, right? So you would solve a third of the climate problem. And the argument here is if we're really serious about 2050 and beyond and zero impact, then you need a 10x improvement, which this technology would give you.
Super helpful. The other thing that's hyper focused on within the rollout of SAF is cost resistance. One of the benefits of it is there's existing infrastructure. We have the technology to process it fairly easily with retrofitting renewable diesel facilities, looking at converting ethanol into sustainable aviation fuel. I guess with using hydrogen fuel cells, right, outside of some of the infrastructure related stuff on the aircraft to retrofit, part of it too would be the access of something like green hydrogen on a cost competitive basis. In the US, there's been programs around it. Can you just kind of speak to your view, how ZeroAvia is addressing the availability of green hydrogen, how that compares on a cost basis longer term to something like sustainable aviation fuel?
Of course, yeah. No, SAF is great in those ways, right? You can use the existing fleets, the existing engines, and all that. Now, we think that, and obviously, ZeroAvia or anybody, we don't have the engines for large aircraft anyway anytime soon, right? So as George mentioned, on the roadmap, we get to single aisle next decade, right? And that's, well, I think we'll get the next decade. Right now, I think we're projecting something like 2032 or something like that, which might be a sporty target, but we're a Silicon Valley venture-backed startup, right? Point being that for a larger aircraft, it's even further out. So you got to do something, while those engines are making their way over there. Yeah, and that means if your engines take in development 20 years to get to a 787, right? We're talking about now long haul, yeah. And then the vehicle lasts 30 years, or the engine lasts 10 plus years. And you probably need a couple of replacement cycles to really make it dance, right? Look at what's happening in the EV space, right? We had EVs, first Teslas, like 15 years ago, right? And we're still, around maybe 10% in the developed parts, yeah? So it takes time, which means that while that replacement cycle happens, what are you going to do? Especially if you're serious about 2050, you're gonna put the replacement fuel like SAF, which is, from the first principles, it's better than fossil for sure, right? But it's not as good as the ultimate fuel that we think will be there, which is hydrogen, right? In aviation, the engine cycle is probably 10, 15 years. The aircraft cycle is 30 years. So you're talking about probably the next 50 years, 50, yeah, when SAF is really going to be critical in transition, yeah? And that's a quite healthy lifetime of investment opportunities, right? So typically you build the ROI in the cases and all that on 12-year, 15-year basis. That's like 3-4 cycles. So it's entirely meaningful thing to do. But then, based on the first principles, the transition will happen. And the reasons are, one is, of course, the climate part, but also we talked a little bit about efficiency of the fuel utilization, but there's also efficiency of fuel production. If you look at the scale of aviation, and by the way, it's growing, right? And I think the statistics is like less than 10% of the world population has been on the plane, and people will get on planes. So it is a growing market. So if you look at the growth rates and look at how much fuel is needed, even with the efficiency improvements and all, you will have to use green hydrogen as feedstock for SAF, right? So you're gonna run out. People are gonna run out of the biostocks pretty quickly. Yeah, definitely not anywhere close to 100% replacement for aviation fuel. And by the way, other people will want it too, right? So you're gonna have to go from the green hydrogen as feedstock, and then if you do the math, from green hydrogen to SAF or green hydrogen to fuel cells, we can actually use the same amount of green hydrogen directly in the fuel cells and deliver the same amount of propulsion as the SAF made from that green hydrogen, without all that capital investment and operating expense of direct air capture or whatever CO2 sources, and then the chemical plant to bind them together and refine and all those things, right? So it's very, very efficient.
Hey Val, I want to jump back in and just ask a couple of questions on sort of timing again, because I think hydrogen kind of goes through these hype cycles. I think everybody sort of suggests it could play a big role in this energy transition long-term equation, but a lot of the oil majors do have hydrogen investments. And if you kind of look at where they're at, they're saying, well, look, we can make it, but there's no demand yet. And so there's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem. So they're probably trying to sort through, like, when can we really start selling this stuff? So that's one question. And then just, I'm curious a little bit on the sort of energy density question. So one of the great things about jet fuel or SAF is they're just, you get a lot of energy in a small volume or weight. And give us a sense of how hydrogen compares on that too. Thanks.
Great question, Rob. So I'll start with the second one. So on the energy density, so specific energy or energy per unit of weight or per unit of mass, hydrogen is superior, right? So it's very lightweight. The specific energy of hydrogen itself is 3 times better than jet fuel. Now, jet fuel you can pour into the wing basically and be done with it, right? So the fuel system weighs 0-ish. The problem with hydrogen is you have to contain it, right? It doesn't want to stay in one place, right? You need to put the tanks around. Now, this is not, well, I guess some of it is rocket science because they use it on the rockets, but liquid hydrogen. But anyway, we know how to make, the industry knows how to make liquid hydrogen tanks. There are some great technologies out there. We actually at ZeroAvia, we work with a couple of partners on it. We're going to demonstrate some flight ready technology, hopefully first half next year on it. And the performance of those tanks, liquid hydrogen tanks, which are dual layer with vacuum insulation, is such that you can, at the fuel tank basis or fuel system basis, can already store more energy per unit of mass of the total fuel system than jet fuel, right? Which means that your what's called mass fraction is over 30%. So you take the full tank of hydrogen of sufficient size, right? It scales with size, it becomes better. And more than 30% of that mass of the fuel to full fuel tank is hydrogen itself, right? And because hydrogen is 3 times better on the energy per mass than jet fuel, that equals out, right? So 3 times better, and then you take 3x off for the fuel tank structures, you end up with parity. But then remember that we have more efficient engine, so we need actually less fuel. So we're already in the positive there. Now, what hydrogen suffers from is volume. Yeah, and you did mention it. So by volume, it's 3.5 times worse than jet fuel. Yeah, so it takes 3.5 times more volume to store the same amount of energy. Okay. Part of mitigation there is efficiency of the engine, and that's why we think hydrogen combustion engines will be a tough go, because especially in sort of sub 100 seat aircraft, because that's where those combustion efficiency is quite low for the turbine engines. So fuel cells can get you 2x. Now, so 3.5x disadvantage becomes, let's say, 2x disadvantage. Initially, what we do is we just say, okay, we're gonna, with the existing types of airframes, we're gonna go half the range. And for a lot of those airframes, like for example, we work with de Havilland Canada, which is the manufacturer, one of the two manufacturers of large propeller planes. Their Q400 Dash 8 400 aircraft is designed, max range, max ferry range of that aircraft is 1,500 nautical miles. Right, that's a 7-hour endurance in the air. Nobody flies those, even for cargo. Nobody flies those airplanes for more than 2 hours. Yeah, so half that range is entirely acceptable for any operator, and that's why we have number of operators lining up for that. But in order to get full advantage of hydrogen as fuel and hydrogen propulsion as propulsion, you would need, of course, to design clean sheet planes around it. Yeah, and that's what happened with the with the jet engines when they appeared back in the day. First, they were put in the conventional or then conventional looking planes, but then people started designing new planes, right? Swept wings and different some differences in control surfaces because of the higher speed, because of the specifics of the engine. And the same thing will happen here. Oh, you had
Great,
you had
George.
also a question on the majors, yeah.
Yeah.
So just real quick. Yeah, everybody's interested. Shell is actually one of the major investors in the company from the very beginning, and then by now we got also a major investor from the Saudi side, NEOM, yeah, with significant fuel interest there to produce hydrogen worldwide for us. We have a partnership with Masdar, which is UAE's main renewable play, and they want to build hydrogen production facilities to match our demands as well. So we see lots of interest. People are standing by, and as soon as we start getting commercial use of these technologies out there, there is a strong backlog, if you will, of partnership projects that are looking to happen. Now, there is a initial sort of activation point, right, that you need to have. And for that, we actually are working directly with airports to bring in the initial production, the initial delivery of fuel.
Good stuff. So can I jump in here? Is that all right, Rob? Is that? So I guess very interesting stuff. I mean, frankly, we all know too, from the investment we're seeing in SAF, it looks like that SAF is never going to get to the point, or it's going to take a long time to get to the point where it gets us to our goals, our 2050 goals. And so I think we're going to miss that unless something changes dramatically. But it still seems like hydrogen's a little bit away for the a little bit too far away to get 2050 goals for maybe the mass market. Like I said, narrow bodies, wide bodies. I guess first thing kind of springs to mind is you already sort of touched on it, but so my question is going to be: do you think ultimately, you said we need a clean sheet design probably to take the most get the most benefit out of hydrogen? So is that really where we are, where you think sort of in order to get a typical narrow body with the same range that we get today, even though we don't use that range, right? We turn typical narrow body 4 times a day, we fly 2 hours. But if we wanted to get the same range that we're getting out of that today, are we going to see a materially different airplane design? And how? And how would that look, maybe?
Yeah. No, good question. And we're working with some of our aircraft partners on just that, kind of studying the concepts and looking at things there. Strictly speaking, you don't have to. Well, you need to. You need to do some design modification, but you can still deliver that with the tube and wing architecture, right? You don't need to go exotic on aircraft design, like because you have even Airbus has this blended wing and wing body design, right? You don't have to go there for the single aisle replacement, at least, right? Maybe for if you want to go 20 hours on the flight, I think the record now is 21 hours. You probably would, but for a single aisle, it can be a matter of just let's take a 737 for example, several extension of fuselages, right? So you can use the smaller passenger section, from the let's say one of the prior smaller shorter length fuselage sections, and use this space for fuel, and that will be sufficient, right? You do need more space because you can use some of the wing space, not the outer wing tanks, and we've done this work with pretty detailed work with Mitsubishi on regional jets, the CRJ and jet family. We can use the root tank. We can use the inner wing tanks, but not the outers because there is not enough space. You can't just pour fuel in there, right? Just like what jet fuel does. So there are some limitations, but you can take some space from the tube, right? It wouldn't be cabin space. You would have a bulkhead there, and behind the bulkhead you can have hydrogen fuel. There is more flexibility, and I know I'm getting into a little bit too technical perhaps, but there is more flexibility for hydrogen tanks in terms of the location in the aircraft, because the fuel is so light. The CG, center of gravity, does not move as much as you use fuel, right? That's why in conventional aircraft, conventionally powered aircraft, you want all the fuel around the center of lift or center of gravity, right? That's why it's in the wings, with hydrogen, you don't have to, because the fuel is so light, and the weight change is relatively minor, compared to jet fuel. So that gives you more flexibility. So you can still use tube and wing for single aisle. For the long haul, you probably would need to do something else. But that's again 20-25 years out, right? For the upper long haul, and Airbus itself is looking to build this a blended wing, and they're also looking at the more conventional tube and wing clean sheet for hydrogen as well, and they've announced it as part of the ZeroAvia program.
Got it. So you think you think blended wing still is sort of the thought process potentially as you get into the longer ranges?
all the way out, all the way out. That's right. I mean, so you can still theoretically do tube and wing. It's just going to be a huge tube, that you would need, or a much bigger tube. If you go there, might as well go to the new type, and the time on this is also, at least from my our selfish perspective, right? We're not going to get those engines out until 20 years out, right? Because these are, you're basically talking about like G90 size engines, and arguably even 20 years is like sporty, so 20 years is enough time to build not just a clean sheet design of an existing type, but a clean sheet design of a new type, and it probably should.
Maybe another quick follow-up. So when I think about the airport infrastructure, help me understand how the airport infrastructure changes, and then maybe help me understand, you probably put some thought to this, in the early days, like let's say you're getting into small regionals initially. What do you do? Because you need that airport infrastructure you obviously can't get it across like a continent all at once. Do you think a couple core routes do you start with this infrastructure? Sort of help us understand what the rollout starts to look like for the commercial world.
Yeah, we spent quite a bit of time on this because when you go to United, for example, right, who's a customer and investor, one of the first questions you ask, you get in front of the fuel guys, right, and they have, as you know, right, they have a robust departments over there with trading desks and everything, right? So and they grill you on how you're not going to bankrupt the operator with fuel shortages or cost fluctuations. So So we had to, and we brought, our fuel partners into those discussions, like Shell and some others I mentioned, and we went through all kinds of models and how we want to roll it out. The short beginning answer is, unlike automotive, right? You can start making business make sense with sometimes just a single operating location, right? So, for example, let's take island operations like Hawaii, for example. Yeah. And there you have a lot of situations when people fly out relatively small aircraft out of the base, and then they go back, and then they go to another one, and that's the mode of operation, right? And the flight is so short that on hydrogen range that we do have, you can go out and back and refuel at the same location, right? So that is just single location covering a lot of flights. The next one is A to B, and you can already be profitable, like San Francisco to Los Angeles, for example, Boston, Philadelphia. Those ranges are within the ranges of our initial offerings, and you can already start making money. Now, the interesting thing is that as we started developing this, we talked to a lot of airports, United States and UK mostly, but some worldwide as well. And we found that airports are super excited about this. Because they see this move to hydrogen as an opportunity to capture more of the value chain of aviation, right? So today, basically, they work with Shell and these oil majors, and sometimes fuel gets trucked in, sometimes it's pipelines, right? But it's mostly hands off, right? So they charge some fees for fuel farm operation and fuel transit, but that's it. Here, they can actually make fuel, right? So that's why a lot of airports already announced some partnerships. We have announced, with the Airbus together, all three top airports in Canada, for example, partnering with us to bring hydrogen to their operations. They look at this as, hey, we can take the fuel farm, allocate some space for hydrogen production, liquefaction, and then it's a short haul, like half a mile to the air sides to fuel the planes. And initially it will be trucks, right? So like, regional airports, you show up, truck shows up, fuels you up, right? We right now developing actually with some partners, 3 different versions of the refueling equipment. One in Europe and 2 in the US to do just that. Yeah. And that will be the first probably 5-10 years, yeah, of operation. And then after that, people are starting to talk about 10-year plus. People are talking about, okay, strategic development of the airport. We're going to build a new set of gates. How do we, potentially pipe fuel there? Yeah. So these are some of the conversations we have. Yeah.
Interesting. Good stuff.
Okay, I think we're really running up on our time here. Normally we only go for half an hour, Val, but we wanted to give a little bit more time to have a fun conversation with you. So, thanks for everyone who stuck with us for the full conversation today. And I want to thank you so much. We normally kind of just have like an internal dialogue where we get on and kind of talk about our research and the things we're publishing, but I think it's always good to hear from external voices. So hopefully we can have you come back on and at some point and hear how it's going. And George, this is the first time you've joined this conversation, but given that jet fuel is about 7% of global oil demand, kind of the trajectory of these conversations really matters when you're trying to piece together what energy markets look like. And at the end of the day, much of the oil complex, like light duty is not that exciting anymore. We might have hit, we're coming up on this sort of, peak gasoline demand construct that's sort of out there in the ether, but jet fuel's the growing piece, right? And so, I think folks are very interested in how quickly some of these new technologies really could come in. So Val, really good to get your framing on it. And I'll just quickly say for anyone who's still on as well, we are currently running a survey amongst all of our clients to get your perspective on these kinds of questions. So I'll send as a follow-up email the link for that survey again, but we really want to know, When do you think oil demand could peak? What do you think the impact on these kinds of questions could have on pricing in the oil market? So let us know. And if you have any other ideas for external guests like Val that we should have on, let us know. We're very open to using this time that we have with you every week to kind of hear from not just the Bloomberg Intelligence team, but the broader community of sort of folks in that energy or sort of in-use space. So Val, once again, thanks for joining us. George, Brett, it's so awesome that you were able to join and kind of help with the conversation here, and we'll look forward to being in touch. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Val.